Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Gabriel Cuellar, professor in practice here at the University of Minnesota School of Architecture. On behalf of the school, thank you for joining us for this event. Today, in the next talk for our Spring 2022 lecture series, we have the great pleasure to welcome a distinguished speaker, Everett Fly. We are thrilled to have you here today, Everett, and really looking forward to learning about your body of work and your approach today. Everett Fly has been practicing in the fields of architecture, landscape architecture, and preservation for over 4 decades. Fly earned a Bachelor of Architecture with honors from the University of Texas at Austin and was the first African-American graduate of the Harvard Graduate School of Design's Master of Landscape Architecture program. His practice explores the vital roles of Black communities in shaping American environments. Since the 1970s, he has been leading a multifaceted applied research project entitled Black Settlements in America, which is dedicated to the documentation, preservation, and revitalization of the places that African Americans have built. As evidence of such places can be hard to come by, Fly reconstructs their histories using a variety of media, including, among many others, land deeds, periodicals, census records, literature, and material remains. Fly also relies on oral histories to not only locate sites that have been demolished, but to record the social dimensions of these places, personal and collective histories, civil rights struggles and achievements, farming and craft practices, and material culture. He has recorded more than 1,300 Black settlements, villages, towns, neighborhoods, and enclaves. Fly has also been closely involved in the research, interpretation, cultural recognition, and visioning of Eatonville, Florida, the first incorporated African-American municipality and childhood town of author Zora Neale Hurston. Alongside his advocacy for Black spatial cultures, Fly has been deeply involved in building institutional support for marginalized histories and the humanities in general. He served on the White House President's Committee, promoting arts and culture at the national level, the State of Texas National Register Board of Review, the Board of Humanities Texas, and among other commissions, the Historic Design and Review Commission of the City of San Antonio, where he is based, and co-founded the San Antonio African American Community Archive and Museum. As much as Fly validates the histories of Black Americans and makes them present for specific communities and the public at large, his practice also enriches the very fields of design and preservation. Fly's work urges spatial practitioners to consider and value a wider spectrum of environmental design. His achievements include work on monumental buildings, such as the Texas Capitol building, but Fly's practice is perhaps rooted in other, less appreciated structures that shape and make up the environment: gardens, yards, streets, vernacular structures, burial sites, and farms, among others. For these important contributions, Fly has been awarded numerous significant awards. Since 1995, he has been a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects. In 2014, the National Endowment for the Humanities and President Obama awarded Fly the National Humanities Medal. Most recently, Fly was awarded the 2021 National Historic Preservation Medal from the National Society of the Daughters of the American Revolution, which recognizes and honors a person who has done extraordinary work over a long period of time in preserving sites and landmarks of historic cultural significance. Thank you very much, Everett, for joining us. Welcome, and please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Cuellar, for that introduction. And I'd like to very much thank the University of Minnesota community, the School of Architecture, and your administration for inviting me to give this talk. Professor Cuellar, as we prepared for this talk, he gave me some themes and points to address as I speak with you today. I don't claim to have the capacity to address every issue or topic with authority, but I can certainly give you, my experiences and my encouragement, because especially those of you who are students, you have so much opportunity, so many opportunities to kind of form a foundation for whatever work that you'd like to do in the future, and advancing our society and culture. And again, I think that from firsthand experience, I think that planners and designers and architects and landscape architects are especially suited in their training as creative visionaries, problem solvers, and practical authors of spaces and places and physical experiences of wherever you might be, not just in the United States, but around the world. My career started with, I guess what you'd say, a practical approach, studying architecture. And then as I moved through that curriculum, I developed a curiosity for landscape architecture. How would a building fit the site or fit the ground? How would a building relate to the environment? And eventually gained a curiosity about culture. How would the building relate to the people and the culture where it was located? And then that, of course, led me to have to take many courses, especially you students will know, many history courses. And of course, they were very broad and comprehensive, everything from European history, Gothic, Roman, Greek, you name it. I had to take it and enjoyed it all along the way. But one of the things that I observed as I went through that experience was that very little was said about indigenous people or people of color. And I would ask folks, what did the indigenous people do, or what did the Hispanic ancestors do, or what did the Black ancestors do? And usually the list of responses was very short. And it wasn't until I got into graduate school and met John Brinkerhoff Jackson that I began to learn about what many today call the cultural landscape. And that is the composite, the group of elements and features that are created by people and people in a society, for life, for work, for recreation, for sustaining themselves, for survival, spiritual worship, sacred places. All of those contribute to what we probably recognize as just an everyday life. But there's a lot of contribution from different groups and different organizations and different entities. And so I kind of had to find my way. This is in the 1970s, and you'll have to remember there was no internet, there was no Google. You couldn't just jump on your computer and search for topics and search for so-called answers. And that's something I want to be careful for, especially the students, to understand today, is that in general, there's very little comprehensive information about historic Hispanic landscapes, indigenous landscapes, African American landscapes that you can find on the internet. There's current interpretations and translations, but to really get at the kind of what I call the root history and the root culture, there's simply no other way than just you have to get out there and do the work. And you should not be afraid of that. It's a tremendously rewarding experience. And I cannot begin to tell you, I don't have the time today to tell you all of the amazing experiences I've had as I've worked my way through different communities and different parts of the United States. But one of the things that I've learned is that an interdisciplinary approach is very important, and you'll hear me talk about that. Professor Cuellar, in his introduction, mentioned that I use different resources, and that's also important. I'll try to refer to that as we go. And the different disciplines, I think it's important to have a team approach. I can go quite a ways with my my own expertise as a landscape architect or an architect, but you know, to really get a whole picture, the archaeologists, the anthropologists, the cultural historians, even the legal scholars, and you'll hear me talk about other disciplines, really add to the content, and many times become essential in order to make the case, because there's so many threats against what many people call intangible resources, where you cannot see the whole building or the whole place or the whole physical product. And so you'll hear me talk about that. My methodology tends to be, I get quite a few questions about that, and have gotten quite a few questions over the years. But the best way that I can describe it is that it's kind of an organic approach. You know, I know that, you know, when I start a project, I want to know something about census data. I want to know something about the physical geography, how the place was laid out. I want to know something about the environment, but each place is a little bit different. Each region, and sometimes even in a state, from one county to another, there are subtle differences. And so again, you have to get on the ground or get in touch with somebody directly in order to understand what makes that place or gives that place its unique cultural landscape. So I've selected two or three projects, I believe, that will give you some reference. I encourage you to, if you have some thoughts or questions, encourage you to hold those to the end, and I'll be happy to pick those up. I'm going to try to save enough time for you to have question and answers. So let me start then. As I said, my approach is interdisciplinary, and my methodology is what I call organic. And it, as you heard Professor Cuellar mention, it does include the history and humanities, archival and oral, archaeology, folklore, foodways. There's a lot that you can learn from what people eat and how they produce what they eat. Sociology, art, urban studies, law, political science, digital technology, planning, architecture, and of course, landscape architecture. The multiple resource and discipline methodology includes, as you heard in the introduction, text records you see there at the top left. And a lot of this turns out to be what historians call primary source. And so the photograph at the top left, those are some original, like, handwritten documents. And a lot of times they're not cataloged, they're not indexed, and you simply have to make the time to read through them or have someone help you read through them. At the bottom left, of course, being an architect and a landscape architect, cartographic records, maps, charts, plats are real important, and they're often overlooked. And as you can see in that photograph at the bottom left, a lot of times they're just mashed in a drawer, and you really have to use your visual capacity to read them and interpret them. The bottom right is photographic records. That one at the bottom right happens to be an image that I came across about 6 or 7 years ago And the only information about it is that faint typing that's at the bottom. It says Elmendorf Black School, teacher and 8 students unidentified. And the source was a lady named Mrs. Leal from the archives. We don't know what archives. The names of the 8 students were not written on the back of the photograph and the name of the teacher. But believe it or not, it took about 3 years. We did find the name of the teacher, where he lived, the name of what we think are the surnames of the students, and a little bit about Mrs. Leal, who collected that photograph. And then at the top right, community oral interviews, we do that a lot and use that a lot. That's a group that we met with. The lady at the top right is my work partner, Ellen Hunt. Ellen's a licensed architect, and we've worked together for more than 30 years now, and have developed a kind of an approach to addressing communities. And it's real interesting once you get them talking and you build their trust in you, they'll share all kinds of things. But I cannot stress enough how important it is to build that community trust and take your time to get to know, to know those people. There have been a lot of injustices. There's been records and even land that has been stolen from people, and I can't blame them for being cautious. And then, of course, the photograph there in the middle center of the image is just good old field work, surveying, measured drawings, documentation, and a lot of times, again, there's no other way to get at it but just to get out into the field. Another reference that, if you're starting to learn about this, might be to study the National Register of Historic Places, the guidelines. The National Park Service has greatly improved the information that it offers online. And the image at the bottom right just happens to be the page related to cultural landscapes. And it even explains the difference between a designed landscape, a difference between a cultural landscape, guidelines for protecting a physical resource, and ways to approach gathering the information. The first example is a project that I worked on. Actually, Ellen and I worked on about 6 years ago. It was in Buffalo, New York, and we were asked to provide an overview for what was called the Michigan Street African American Heritage Corridor. And if you look at the slide, in the middle of the map, there's a little pin that says Buffalo. And then just to the right of that pin that says Buffalo, there's an area where several leaders of, to the images come together, those endpoints. That's where the Michigan Street Cultural Heritage District was located. But as we went through the research, we found out that there were many other connections, to that district. And so what we decided to do was use kind of highlight images around the perimeter of the map. And I won't go through all of them. We could come back, but interestingly enough, at the top right, you see that cameo of Jackie Robinson. And Jackie Robinson was the first African American to integrate the Major League Baseball. The new baseball season is just starting for you sports fans, but Jackie played some of his earliest games in Buffalo with the team from Canada there in Buffalo. And there are traces of the ball field where he played there in Buffalo. Just below Jackie is the Michigan Avenue YMCA, designed by John Brent, an African-American architect, and I'll talk about him in a moment. And just below him is Mr. Julius Rosenwald, who was a national philanthropist But Mr. Rosenwald was a Jewish American businessman who contributed to establishing the Rosenwald Fund, and he was the CEO of Sears and Roebuck. And Mr. Rosenwald actually traveled to Buffalo. We found out from researching the Y building that Mr. Rosenwald actually traveled to Buffalo to help dedicate the building. On the left side of the map, second from the top below the lion, is Harriet Tubman. And the Michigan Street District initially was known for the role that it played in the Underground Railroad. And the crossing that Harriet Tubman is said to have used going to Canada is marked in Buffalo. So there's strong documentation that Harriet Tubman and or folks that she organized to escape slavery passed through the Michigan Street District. And then two cameos below Harriet Tubman is Frederick Douglass. And Frederick Douglass actually gave a speech, a public speech at a public park on the west side of Buffalo right before emancipation. The additional research that we did revealed that the Michigan Street Y was designed by John Brent, and that's Mr. Brent there in the bottom in the center, John Edmonston Brent. And again, this is an example of how we research. We traced Mr. Brent as far as we could, and it turned out that his father, Mr. Brent's father, Calvin T.S. Brent, was the first African-American architect to practice in Washington, D.C. after the Civil War. And Mr. Brent was one of fewer than 4 African-Americans to practice simultaneously as an architect and a landscape architect. Mr. Brent went to Tuskegee, and you'll hear Tuskegee mentioned a number of times. And then from Tuskegee, Alabama, he went to Drexel Institute in Philadelphia to do his advanced architectural studies. Tuskegee training included landscape, they called it at that time, landscape gardening. And so that's where he developed his skill for that. And of course, Drexel honed his skill as an architect. And eventually we found Mr. Brent's descendants who still live in Buffalo. And they shared at the bottom right is Mr. Brent's architect's license certificate. They also had a copy of drawing that Mr. Brent had done of the Michigan Street Y building. That's the image at the top right. But we continued to research. They told us about Mr. Brent's professional life, and it turned out that he designed some of the gates, some of the main entrance gates at the Buffalo Zoo. And we were able in that, you saw that image earlier of the drawer, the file drawer with the architectural drawings. We were able to find actual drawings done and initialed by Mr. Brent. And that's a vignette of the Buffalo Zoo gates at the bottom left. The Buffalo Zoo is important because it was one of the earliest and one of the oldest public zoos in the United States. And we were able to develop a nomination, a National Register nomination for the zoo gates that you see there at the top left. And in 2013, they were placed on the National Register of Historic Places. The folks in Buffalo did not realize until we brought all this to their attention, the significance of Mr. Brent and the significance of his working on those gates and that public landscape. But it took a year just to do the National Register work. Circling back down here in Texas, this project is the Hockley Griffin Winters family. The gentleman that you see at the top left is Major J. Michael Wright, U.S. Air Force retired. In other words, this is a jet fighter pilot who retired here in San Antonio, and he found this overgrown lot. That's what he's looking at, that overgrowth in his neighborhood, and he got curious about it. He did some research and discovered that it was a lost African-American cemetery. So the aerial at the top right, the yellow outline shows the outline of the cemetery. The subdivision plat at the bottom right shows the civil engineering drawing that was filed with the city. And then the aerial at the bottom left, a 1939 aerial, shows the cemetery, the roads or lanes that were nearby. But you can see it says there was a colored church and the Hockley farm. And it turns out that the Hockleys were former enslaved persons who bought this land in the 1870s and began to farm. This property is located about 13 miles north of downtown San Antonio. This started in 2015, so I'm going to have to move through this quickly because it took from 2015 until this past February in order to kind of reach a benchmark on it. In the process, we discovered that the African-American folks that lived in this area also, remember, this is Texas. And so they traded and bred livestock, cattle, goats, and so forth. And these are two brand certificates that were filed at the county courthouse. The one on the left, the YOK brand, was filed by Jane Warren, and Jane was the matriarch of the Hockley family, where that cemetery was located. And she filed her brand certificate in 1875. These are the kinds of authentic references that I look for in my work, because I think it's really important. I can't tell you how many inquiries I've had, especially since the Black Lives Matter movement, about representing and designating historic African-American achievements. And one of the things I'm kind of a stickler about is that kind of cliches or modern interpretations in my book are not good enough. We need to look for authentic references like these. So I took that YOK brand and had it embroidered on a cap. And most days, these times, this is one of the caps that I wear because it's an authentic representation of the efforts and the achievements of these people. It turned out that Jane Warren was between 1850 and 1900. She was only one of about 5 African-American women in Bexar County, Texas, to file a livestock brand. But there were more than 80 African-American men who had livestock brands filed in Bexar County. When we started in 2000, after 2015, we started looking for ways to clear this cemetery. And these are the 2 photographs you can see at the top left. That's what it looked like at the entrance to the cemetery in early 2018. And that's a drone photo at the bottom right of how it had become overgrown. By this time, of course, the site is in the city limits of the city of San Antonio, and San Antonio has different regulations for clearing and brush removal. And so we had to get a permit for the brush removal. But I was really surprised. We organized at the bottom right, we organized more than 100 individual volunteers to come out and start helping with the clearing. But I was surprised at the top left, the City of San Antonio Solid Waste Department called and offered and said that if we could haul the brush to the street, that they would have the big brush trucks come and pick it up. And so from late 2017 through 2018, we were able to pick up more than 300 cubic yards of brush, and the city of San Antonio hauled it away with no charge. Texas A&M at College Station got interested, and the Center for Heritage Conservation offered to send a team of graduate students down to do ground penetrating radar. The photograph at the top left, the gentleman with the straw hat is City Councilman Clayton Perry. And I made a presentation to him and explained that in San Antonio has council districts, geographic districts. So I explained to Councilman Perry that he had in his districts 3 African-American cemeteries, all more than 100 years old. And immediately he began to offer assistance. And so when A&M showed up, he happened to be an A&M grad. He came out to encourage them and get the site documented. A&M at College Station also sent a team to do LIDAR, light detection and ranging scans. What we were trying to do is use those 2 sets of documents and overlay them to figure out where the graves might be located, because the cemetery, the markers had been desecrated. In other words, the markers had actually been either picked up, knocked over, or broken apart. The University of Texas San Antonio Center for Archaeological Research offered to help us with surface archaeological investigation. And so they prepared they sent 2 teams out, and they prepared a detailed report. And the image at the right shows a series of aerial photographs they found dating between 1929 and 1986. And you can see, if you just follow the chronology, how the site changed. And then by talking around in the community, we were able to find living descendants of the Hockley family. And the 2 descendants you see in the photograph, the gentleman in the pink shirt is Mr. Zelder Clay. He's in his 90s now. And Mr. Velmill Clay in the gray shirt is in his late 80s. And they both came out once we got the site cleared and told us what they recalled coming out to this site as young boys. It turned out that Mr. Zelder, the gentleman in the pink shirt, actually helped dig some of the graves, and helped put up some of the early fence posts. And through their discussion, with the descendants, we were able to figure out that there were encroachments into the cemetery, and the encroachment happened to occur. You look at this slide at the far right, where you see what looks like an outdoor swimming pool, because the Clays said that they remembered coming to the site from that side because their grandmother's house was located in that direction, and that was the way they approached the cemetery. Fortunately, one of my business contacts, a certified land surveyor, offered to help us with the survey. And once he did the survey, this was the result. The area that you see in the light green is the cemetery proper. The 2 areas, the kind of pink and violet, is the area of encroachment. The light yellow and the light blue are the 2 residential lots that had encroached into the cemetery. It turned out that those 2 landowners, the light yellow and the light blue, had bought the land without a survey and didn't realize that their backyards had encroached into the cemetery. And so once we had this survey, we were able to cross-reference it to the civil engineering plat, and the city of San Antonio verified that this survey, as they said, was spot on. And there was no question about that there were encroachments. And so this is what the cemetery looks like today. We were able to get that land cleared out, get the encroachments returned to the family. And this past February, the City of San Antonio Historic Review Board designated the Hockley Cemetery as a historic heritage site. Now, that's not the same as a National Register site. That's a local designation, but it puts the cemetery site on the city list and in the city files, so that in the future, if there's any threats or encroachments, they'll send an inspector out immediately. The city of San Antonio is also unique in that it has it actually has 2 full-time archaeologists on staff, and that really helps with these kinds of problems. The next example, you heard Professor Cuellar mention Eatonville, Florida. The X in the middle of the map, right there where it says Orlando, that's where Eatonville is located. And it is one of the oldest African-American towns in the United States. When I first went to Eatonville in 1990, started researching, this was one of the few early maps that I could find. And if you look at the bottom of the map, there are a group of sections that move across the bottom of the map, and you can see there's a kind of a meandering line there at the bottom. That it turned out that line was actually a Native American migratory path. In other words, every season, the Native Americans in that part of Florida would travel that path in order to find game and natural plants that they used in their culture. And it just happens to pass through what is now Eatonville. And that path ran along, if you look at the top left, that road sits on top of that path today. So there are layers of history in Eatonville. And the Orange County had proposed a 4-lane divided thoroughfare right there on that road through Eatonville in order to accommodate commercial traffic from one side of the county to the other. But it also turns out that road, if any of you have read Zora Neale Hurston's Dust Tracks on a Road, that is the road in Zora's book. And so I pointed that out when I went to Eatonville 30 years ago. I pointed that out to the residents, and they have used that as a reference point for the Zora Neale Hurston Festival for the Arts and Humanities. Eatonville is a little bit less than 3,000 residents. It encompasses roughly a square mile. And every year when they have the festival, more than 100,000 people show up. And there are all kinds of crafts that the lady there at the bottom left, Miss Ella Johnson Dinkins, is holding up a quilt that she made. We lost Miss Dinkins last year, but she was a tremendous source of information and community pride. And then the photograph at the bottom right is a group of K through 12 teachers who came to Eatonville specifically to see the places that Zora Neale Hurston wrote about in her books. And they came because they wanted to be able to tell their students firsthand what Eatonville looked like and how Zora had interpreted. And then this map I did in an oral interview session with a group of seniors, and it was really interesting because what architects and engineers would recognize as a kind of a geometric grid that had defined the street layout of Eatonville. But you see the gray and the dark gray lines, those were the informal pathways that developed in Eatonville over time. And I came across this when I would ask folks for directions, and they really couldn't tell me a street intersection, but they could tell me a path to follow. And so that was an interesting learning experience. And then lo and behold, over the years, going back and forth to Eatonville, I discovered that there was a tremendous gardening legacy there. And I guess landscape architects would call it, vernacular gardening, because, they don't follow the geometry that trained landscape architects would follow. And a lot of what they grow are things that can be eaten or traded, bartered, for goods. And so the top left is a vernacular garden. The top right is a lady who grew wild berries, and she would hand them out across the city, across the town, and people would make pies and jelly and so forth. That kind of became the signature of Eatonville. The man at the bottom right, I called him the cane master of Eatonville. Those are greens. You see those big plants there, those are greens. And then the tall plant to his left is sugarcane. And it turns out that Eatonville, when it first started, the community produced a lot of sugarcane. Sugarcane was used as a sweetener in different recipes around Florida. And so they would sell the cane syrup to the hotels and the resorts surrounding Eatonville. And annually, they would produce more than 500 gallons of cane. And it kind of, became a trading asset. And then the photograph at the bottom left is one of the early mayors of Eatonville. You can read there, it says Joe Clark, and he is standing in his pineapple farm. In other words, African Americans in Eatonville had citrus growth, and they sold pineapples, grapefruit, oranges, etc., again, to the surrounding businesses. So as I close, what I'd like to encourage you to do is look at the resources that you would have in your area or there in Minnesota. And many of you are probably familiar with this. The Cultural Landscape Foundation is developing a database, and they've already, for example, identified the Hiawatha Golf Club right there in your community in Minneapolis, Twin Cities. Again, when I was coming along, we didn't have these kinds of resources or references. But if you don't know Mr. Birnbaum, Charles Birnbaum and his team, and the Cultural Landscape Foundation, you should get to know them and follow up with their database. It's really remarkable and really helpful. And this would be something that you can get online and start to build a reference for. And then recently, you all were fortunate to receive a grant from the National Trust for Historic Preservation for their Telling the Full History Preservation Fund. I had the great privilege to serve on the jury for this program. I did not specifically review University of Minnesota proposal, but what I would encourage you to do is to look at your other grantees in this program. It was very inspiring to see the range of interests, the range of stories. The smaller map there at the top right shows the distribution, the geographic distribution across the country of the grants. And I can tell you, from serving on that jury, that the National Trust is committed to, doing this again, adding to the stories. And there's a great deal to learn from them. Again, I can't begin to tell you how many times I've been approached, especially in recent months, with the Black Lives Matter movement. Many institutions, businesses, organizations, communities are pressed to take some action that shows physical representation, physical monumentation of indigenous and ethnic and African American history and culture. And again, this is just my opinion, that I don't believe that we have the vocabulary as yet in order to do these histories and experiences justice. This has been neglected. This has been an area that's been neglected for so long, and so much has been lost, erased, demolished, etc., that there is no quick fix. I wish I could tell those entities that there's already something that's been done, or there's a set of images and icons that you can simply overlay. But again, I don't think that that's authentic. I think it's oversimplification, and I think that the precursors, the ancestors that made sacrifices deserve credit. They deserve to be recognized. They deserve to be represented by images that of things and places that they helped create. You saw Miss Ella Dinkins holding up that quilt. The color scheme. I talked to her. I had a great privilege to talk to her many times, and I asked her, how did she pick those colors and how did she pick those patterns? And you designers will understand. She simply said, well, it just caught my eye. It just gave me a good feeling. It just felt like Eatonville. And so I think that's what we need to learn to do, learn to respect, learn to represent in our work. Again, I want to thank you for allowing me this time, and I'll look forward to taking any questions that you might have. I like the questions and answers better than me just talking. So let me turn it back to Professor Cuellar and get into the questions and answers.
Thank you, Everett. That was amazing. Really, really incredible. Enjoyed it so much. I'm going to quickly turn on the lights, and I'll return in one moment. Okay, thank you again. So as I mentioned, we have some people here in the audience in person. If anyone here present in the presentation room has a question, just raise your hand and I'll be happy to call on you. Likewise, those of you who are in the Zoom room, feel free to use the chat function, and then we can present your question to Everett. Questions in the audience here? Not yet. Okay, so I could start with the question, Everett. I guess the first question has to do with the types of adjustments or accommodations that come from when you do your research, but on the part of the people who live around or live in the vicinity of the place that you're studying. I'm thinking what comes to mind is, for example, the Hockley Clay Cemetery. When you found that actually two of the houses were encroaching, what kind of discussion or conversation did you have with those landholders? It seemed like in the end you moved the fence to kind of reclaim what was the cemetery's original size. But I guess in that case or in other cases, how have you found it uncovering, revealing, putting certain historical findings on the table somehow suggest a change or some adjustment that people could be making in the vicinity where they are?
Sure, thanks. I think I get it. A couple of things real quick. San Antonio is unusual in that we have a our Office of Historic Preservation is a permanent office, and it is part of what we call development services. In other words, if you're going to build anything in San Antonio, historic preservation is on the checklist. So if your project doesn't have any historic resources or features, you can check that off. But if it does, then your project, your drawings, your specs, or whatever you submit, your subdivision plat, whatever, has to go through the Office of Historic Preservation, just like it goes through structural review, just like it goes through utilities, etc. Mechanical, electrical, plumbing, all that. That's part of it, what we do. And I understand that every city doesn't have that, but that in San Antonio, that gives folks a tool, just like it does, for kind of the development community. So that's the first thing to understand, is that we have that layer here in San Antonio that allows you to address that. So I showed you in that photograph, Major Mike Wright, looking at that overgrown lot. And so Major Wright, he actually lives in that neighborhood. So he was good enough to start to reach out to those neighbors who had encroached in the cemetery. And I'm sure you can understand that initially they simply did not believe us. They said, "Oh, you're just trying to take our land, go away." But then once I presented it to the city councilman, how they say, it kind of raised the attention, the executive attention to this. It wasn't just community folks. Then it becomes the city councilman is looking at this because, he's got to represent, the codes and the ordinances and the regulations and so forth of the city. And then once we got the survey, I can't tell you how important that survey was. The surveyor works with me. He's the surveyor that does my commercial surveying work. And so when he heard about what I was doing, he just volunteered. And I told him we didn't have the money to pay him, but he said it was so interesting. He wanted to see, if the survey matched. And so he, using all the modern, GPS coordinate material equipment, and he went out, he sent his team, his field team out, and they surveyed the corners of every lot that touched the boundary of the cemetery. And then they went out to the coordinate points of the survey, the original survey, and tied everything back, to that, the datum points of the survey. And when he came back with his survey, he said that they were within 1/4 of an inch of the original survey. And then when we took that survey back to the city to compare with the plat that was originally filed in 1980, the city said the same thing. They said, "You're spot on." And so then you're into, here's our team approach and the disciplines. Then you're into real estate law, because that meant that those two property owners were trespassing. And so we literally had to work through that, explaining to the property owners that technically you're trespassing. If how would I say, if we wanted to be aggressive, we could actually go to court and just make you move the fence and so forth. But if you'll work with us, we'll find ways to help. And so that's what we did. We found a fence company that was willing to donate some of the labor. We did have to pay for the materials, but the homeowners did not. They wound up not having to pay to move to move the fence, and then and they didn't have to pay for the fence. They got a new fence. And then there was one that we're working to get him some new plants. He had planted some screening shrubs on one end. And so we're working to get a donation of some plant material for him. And so that's the way we did it. But it took 2 years just from that first point of the neighbors saying, we don't believe you, to them saying, okay, now we do believe you, and we'll let the fence be moved. It took 2 years just for that.
That's incredible. What a story. That's really fascinating to hear. We've had some questions come in from the Zoom Q&A, so I'll turn to those now. There's a question from Mary Begley, who asks, or says and asks, fabulous talk, thank you. The power of preservation to unearth and interrogate historical cultural spaces is clear and compelling. Adaptive reuse in Minneapolis often has the flavor of gentrification. How can those architects interested in preservation understand the force of their work as tied to contemporary capital? How do you see the relationship between preservation, reuse, and gentrification?
That's a great question. I don't see how you can get away from it. I use the the Buffalo project is just as one, outside of Texas. Of course, the Eatonville project was in Florida, and I have a kind of a portfolio of other projects, in different states outside of Texas. But in each one, that issue comes up. Gentrification. How do you coordinate with new development? How do you coordinate with adaptive reuse? And for me, my suggestion is that architects, landscape architects, planners, it's kind of a colloquial way to say it, but you just have to go back to school on it. In other words, the interest is growing around the country. There are different, I mentioned a couple of, the Cultural Landscape Foundation, the National Trust, is doing workshops and presentations. The National Trust does presentations at their annual meetings where, you could actually go or Zoom in and learn about adaptive reuse and what, folks are doing. But there's no easy way to separate or just pretend that they don't intersect or they don't exist. Like I said, the project in Florida had to do with the county proposing that thoroughfare through Eatonville, and it would have practically it would have divided Eatonville. In other words, the thoroughfare would have been so wide that the north side of Eatonville would have been separated from the south side. I've had another community in Hobson City in Alabama, where the county is going through and looking for municipal boundaries, and those boundaries for Hobson City, if they're taken away or if they're changed, changes what Hobson City can do for itself. And Hobson City is another African American community, and then I'm sure that some of you heard about the case in California recently called Bruce's Beach, where the African American family had started a resort, and the county out there in Los Angeles came and took the resort by eminent domain. And recently, the descendants of the Bruce family were able to, get that land back, and they had to go to court, but the court found that the land was taken arbitrarily and without fair compensation. So those are just examples of what I'm saying is that it's a really significant issue, and you just have to, like I said, start to learn about it, go to school on it, and be aware, be alert, look for it.
Thank you. That's very insightful. Another question has come through on the Zoom as well, from an anonymous attendee who says the following. Thanks for a great presentation, Mr. Fly. It's fascinating to see how interdisciplinary your work is. What recommendation do you have for the professions today to increase representation of Black architects and landscape architects? What is one recommendation you have for those who find themselves the only one to survive and thrive in the profession and not to be discouraged?
Oh, well, that's a big question. The American Society of Landscape Architects has recently initiated a couple of initiatives, and I would say definitely, contact them because they can help you. What would I say? Make some contacts, get in a network, and then there's an affinity group out of the American Society of Landscape Architects called the Black Landscape Architects Network. And Mr. Glenn Smith is one of the leaders of that Black Landscape Architect. And they've recently put together kind of like a mentorship or internship program. I don't know what level the questioner is at. I don't know if they're licensed or student, et cetera, but that network would certainly help. And I'm not the only one that's in that network. Glenn has really worked hard. Glenn and several others have really worked hard to set it up, and I'm sure that they could find or help find for this person some contacts. But one last thing I would say, of encouragement is, when I started this, it was just like an intuition, just a feeling that I had that, I had to answer this question for myself. And as I went through, I kept saying I said, I can't stop, and I hope that that's the way the person that wrote the question would feel, is that it might seem like you can't get through that or get to the next step, but it's wide open. There are not enough landscape architects of color, period, and the need is so great that I think if you stick to it, it's really going to open up for you.
Thank you so much. Another question from a student, Jacob Mala, who has the following comment. Thank you, Everett, for your amazing presentation. What I am struck by is the amount of time invested in your work. Working on a project for 7 years and it still seems to be in progress. How do you understand time as a part of your work? As history develops and changes, the more you learn. How do you work on projects knowing that it may take years to see any resolution for the projects to come to a conclusion?
That's another great, good question. How do I want to? It's kind of like I don't know if any of you have taken the math class, calculus. That it's not just calculus is not just 1 and 1 is 2, but calculus is taking a set of variables and then either plotting or calculating for their relative change through the course of that formula. And I have to admit that like when I first went to Eatonville, I never imagined that it would be 30 years and counting in development. But if you look at history and you look at the classical cities or the great civilizations or whatever, you have to recognize that they all evolved over time. And I hope this doesn't sound like an oversimplification, but if you look at whether it's Rome, Italy, or Paris, France, or New York, they didn't just happen, overnight. They evolved over centuries, decades, long periods of time. And so, especially if you're in the urban planning and urban design, that has to be part of your work. That was one of the interesting things that I learned, when I was at the Graduate School of Design, is, being there with the city planners and the urban designers and listening to them talk about that exact point is, how is this plan? What are the stages of implementation for this plan? And then, of course, if you're looking at adaptive reuse or change, how much time and so forth will it take to do that? And then you've got the factor of people. You may not be dealing with the same people at the beginning as at the end of the project, and you just have to be prepared for that. But it's just something that I learned as I worked on these projects, is that it would take time, and sometimes you feel like, I don't have enough time, I got to get this done, and go on to something else. But it's kind of like the nature of, as I say, the nature of the beast is being able to to deal with that issue. And if I feel like if I can help either protect or set a reference point for conservation or preservation or protection of that resource or that community, even if it's just a reference point, that's important. It doesn't have to be, the absolute end.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you so much. I have another question that I would like to pose, waiting for others to come through. Has to do with the agency and the role of designers, because so much of the work that you've described has to do with vernacular or folk design. How would, let's say, professionally, how do you think about the role of professionally trained designer within the context of a cultural landscape which has not necessarily been designed by any single designer, but somehow brought together by many different practices over time? How, maybe you could describe it within your own practice. And because as you mentioned, the people in Eatonville have made their own kind of pathways. They've created their own town in a sense. And so a professional designer, how to approach a place like that where design is already happening in a sense?
Well, and that is a good question. Personally, I would not trade my formal education, architecture or landscape architecture, for another tool in dealing with, vernacular resources, whether it's buildings or landscape. Because what I've found is the professional training, all those history classes looking at, like I said, whether it's, the classical orders or, the garden landscapes, et cetera, all that training really helps me when I see something different. It really helps me recognize or identify that, hey, that's different. It doesn't fit the Olmsted pattern, or it doesn't fit Mies van der Rohe's, style or approach. When I did the project in Buffalo, New York, and the Buffalo Zoo happens to sit on the edge of the park, the major park. The name has escaped me right now, but initially, when I proposed the nomination for the zoo gates, there were people in Buffalo that they said, "Oh, that's just part of the Olmsted design." And fortunately, because I had actually gone to the Graduate School of Design, because I had actually studied in person Olmsted landscapes in Boston, the Emerald Necklace, et cetera, I could tell them, I could say right away, you're wrong. because I've actually been and studied, and some of my professors were Joseph Hudak was my plant materials professor, and at the time he was teaching, he was part of the successor Olmsted firm. And Hudak had taken us to their office, and we had looked at their plans, and I could tell right away that that wasn't right, and was able to use that. And then getting down to, like say, nitty gritty, looking at materials, and that's why I put it in the title of my talk. Looking at materials and so forth. Again, the formal training, gives me knowledge about how modern materials are put together. But when I look at an old building, again, I can recognize when there's a unique quality about the workmanship, or the craftsmanship, or even the material itself. This brick doesn't look like a manufactured brick, or these plants don't fit the all the common horticultural ornamental horticultural palettes that are being used. These are some unique plants. So I mean, that's how I use it, and I think that the designer should be. You don't have to dedicate, your practice or your work to historic preservation. Believe it or not, my whole practice is not historic preservation. It's just, as the questioner asked earlier, there are just so few African American landscape architects that I get a lot of calls, but the way that you should approach it, I think, is just to be aware. If you're aware that there's something out there, or another way to look at it, then at least you can call somebody. You don't have to call me, but you could call somebody, and you could call Glenn Smith, or you could call Karen Phillips. These are African American landscape architects, and ask them if they've seen this or heard this. You would be amazed, at the kind of support information that you can get.
That's very, very helpful. Thank you so much. I will pose another question. I guess it's has to do with the Black Settlements in America project, which has been, somehow a essential part of your career over the long period that you've been practicing. How do you see that project moving forward, or what sort of ambitions do you have for it? Let's say going forward. It has been very multifaceted, containing a variety, so many different projects, types of collaborations. How are you engaging with it, let's say today, or what kind of projects would you like to take on? Or how do you kind of navigate the present going forward in terms of this particular project, which has been so formative and made so many contributions?
Well, Gabriel, that's another big question. Once I got about 10 years into it, how they say it kind of took on a life of its own. Mm-hmm. And as different communities found themselves in different situations, they would say, well, we need, I told you about Eatonville, but I guess about 15 years ago, a group of African American towns called and said that they were trying to figure out as a group how and where they should go. And it turned out that that group of towns or communities was interrelated, because kind of at the nucleus was Tuskegee, Alabama itself, Tuskegee University and Tuskegee Institute that was started by Dr. Booker T. Washington. And so they were trying to develop ways to explain and highlight that relationship. And then there are other communities that they're connected to the Rosenwald schools. You heard me mention Julius Rosenwald. And folks know that there was a school there, but they don't know who all the teachers were. They don't know how the teachers got there. They don't know. And the teachers are important because you heard me talk about John Brent, because he went to Tuskegee, and part of his training at Tuskegee was to teach in the community. The first school teacher in Eatonville came directly from Tuskegee, and he's the one that taught them how to organize themselves to grow that sugarcane that I talked about. And so there's a whole lot that we don't know, and I do mean we, America collectively, about the, those cultures and those histories and those contributions. And so I'd hope that some folks would pick some of these, I call them threads or themes, pick some of them up and, take them forward. Myself, kind of getting to that other part of your question, myself, I'd like to do some more writing about this. And as I mentioned, the Black Lives Matter movement has kind of created another level of interest. And that's why I mentioned earlier the institutions, businesses, even municipal governments that have contacted me and said, well, we want to do a memorial and here's what we'd like to do. And like I said, some of them are well thought out, but most of them are not, and most of them haven't done their homework. Most of these entities have not done their homework. In other words, they really don't know the authentic history behind, their place, their landscape, their neighborhoods, etc. And so if I could help them, maybe that's what I'll be doing, maybe helping some of them learn and understand, and certainly interested in helping younger folks understand about this, because we're not there yet. We're on the way, we collectively, and there's so much work to be done.
Yeah, that's fantastic to hear, and I think that everything that you mentioned, I would definitely be looking forward to, and I'm sure many others as well. So that's wonderful to hear. And as we're approaching the end of our allotted time, unfortunately, I want to thank you, Everett, so much for such an inspiring presentation and bringing to University of Minnesota and the students such a compelling, rich, just every word that I could describe, just a really wonderful practice. And I think it will make an impact here for some time to come. So thank you very much, and thank you for generously.
I'll be interested to see what you all do, and you have raised my curiosity. And as I mentioned, those examples from the Cultural Landscape Foundation and your application to the National Trust.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's definitely some really important work happening here and everywhere, and we appreciate that you highlighted those resources. That's really great. So thank you again. Thank you for everyone who is here. Yes, another round of applause.
Thanks.
Just really enjoyed it so much. Thank you, Everett. Take care, and we'll talk to you soon.
Okay, good luck.
Thank you. Bye-bye.